is strange. Okay, how about now?
Yeah, seeing the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Liz, for confirming. As you might have seen from my notes, the first thing on the agenda is to say hi to everyone. And thank you very much for joining us today for this active session on book usage matrix sharing and use Guardrails. This is an active session to inform the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust. My name is Ursula. I'm the community manager for the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust, an effort supported by the Mellon Foundation through its project. Thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, let's have a look at what we have in store for today. So the agenda has 3 different parts, and I want to give you an idea on how it will look like, and of course, how you can participate in this discussion since it's an active session. First, I hope you will allow me to tell you a little bit more about the challenge of the open access book usage data and how this has been addressed through the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust effort over the past few years and what we are currently working on. Specifically, the solution to the challenge in the form of the so-called data space or international data space solution. We will do some looking into specifics of the data rulebook as well for community governance, which is part of the international data space solution, and looking at some terms and definitions that we would really much like your input on. Finally, through some open questions and polls, we would love your input on the trust as part of the Open Access Book Usage Data Exchange that is at core of the rules and functionalities within the data space. I will be sharing some slides as well, where you will be seeing QR codes, which are part of the Mentimeter tool that I will be using. There will also be a website that you can use instead if you don't have your mobile phone at hand. But if you haven't used it before, please don't worry. We will have a test run as well when the time comes. Of course, during the presentation or in active part, please do unmute yourself, ask questions, raise your hand, and share your thoughts. So to start with the overview, when we talk about the open access book usage data, I have a suspicion that many of you encounter challenges when trying to gather usage information, since it's created and gathered from different sources. Publishers, book aggregators, internal reporting systems, and so on. Additionally, I believe in an open access book supply cycle, as you will see in the next slide. There is different usage data created by a variety of stakeholders. And this is at core of what the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust is working on, to provide a solution and to be an intermediary between all the different sources of usage and help with that process for a cross-platform curation and aggregation at scale, and explore as well how we can do benchmarking. In the next slides, I will show you some reports that came out of the mentioned investigations as well within the last years. First up, in 2021, Michael Clark and Laura Ritchie produced this report based on various interviews to document how usage data flows across stakeholders in the scholarly communication lifecycle. You can see how generated usage data on the right travels through library management systems, book aggregators, publishing platforms, and repositories, which in turn generate structured usage data reports for the publishers, libraries, scholars, funders on the left. You can also see how publishers and libraries share the burden of combining multiple structured usage data reports. The report shown that contains this image goes more into detail on the challenges organizations face when compiling usage data from multiple sources, like navigating inconsistent metadata or non-counter compliant usage. I invite you to have a look at this link as well within our Zenodo community if you're interested. The second report that was published as the Open Access Book Usage Data Analytics and Reporting Use Cases by Stakeholder was to illuminate the specific data analytics and reporting queries sought by different book publishing and discovery stakeholders. It found that different book stakeholders wanted to use open access usage data, but also in different ways, not just for reporting, but for internal operations and strategic data-driven decision-making. The applications of open access usage data are wide-ranging, from informing collection development or editorial strategy to evaluating promotional campaigns, informing print editors, etc. So publishers and libraries sought to leverage open access book usage analytics for open access book program operations. We also found that something that's common to all was a shared burden of having to allocate time and expertise to combine and manage counter-compliant reports alongside related data and non-counter-compliant web analytics. And this is where the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust can step in and reduce resources spent on cross-platform data curation and aggregation via economies of scale. This will also make open access book usage and discovery benchmarking possible. Based on the work from the previous report, both reports, the solution was offered via the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust, and it was formalized in its vision and mission. The aim of this effort is to champion strategies for the improved publication and management of open access books. And this is achieved by exchanging reliable usage data in a trusted, equitable, and community-governed way that falls in line with the open principles for scholarly infrastructure. This effort now sits alongside a board of trustees that governs our overall effort strategy. In fact, I believe that we have one of our trustees in the audience, Charla Lair, who is the board chair. Charla, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Hi, everybody. So I'm Charla Lair. I'm a senior strategist for open access and scholarly communication initiatives at Lyrasis, but also, as Ursula said, I am chair of the board of trustees for this wonderful project. I'm very excited that Library Publishing Coalition accepted this proposal so that it could be talked about in this community. You all are very key stakeholders in this, and so just ask whatever questions you have. We don't know what we don't know. And this is one of those projects that we're just all diving in and figuring out together what good questions to ask that lead to other big questions. We're going to get good at asking lots of big questions here. So thank you for coming to this, and I'll give it back to you, Ursula.
Thank you so much, Charla, and thank you for being here and for your support. It's very much appreciated. So as she mentioned, we are working on making it easier to have trusted, holistic open access usage data exchange, aggregation, benchmarking across public and private platforms and services. And this is at the core of what the entire project and Data Trust is trying to achieve. Since, as we know, book publishers, publishing platforms and services and libraries all rely on book usage data to inform their operations. So your input is very much appreciated and important. Across these industries, we know that staff must address the burden of managing and curating usage data provisioned in counter-compliant and non-compliant reports, and that these institutions individually manage, compile, and link usage data metrics, some of which are provisioned via dashboard services for users ranging from scholars, research offices, and funding agencies to editors, etc. So recognizing that we have to work across the range of open access book stakeholders, we've been aiming to develop community governance structures that recognizes that publishers, discovery services, libraries, repositories, and analytic services all may be creating usage data or have an interest in accessing process or raw usage data. This is not a situation only encountered within the scholarly communication sphere. Many other industries have a similar experience, and this is where the industry data space comes from. Its aim is to provide a digital infrastructure to support this type of data exchange. To draw comparisons with existing similar initiatives, we can compare the open access book usage data space model to, for example, open access switchboard. The data space model works on the similar principle of data exchange, with a difference that it adapts a digital infrastructure supported by the European Commission, widely used in Europe. and it's a certifiable type of entity. It is also open to any stakeholder interested, and in this case, focused on open access books. In this image here, you can actually see how the general model of the international data space works, what are its components, and what is needed in terms of the different entities part of this data space. As mentioned, the European Commission has been supporting this model within Europe for various different industries. The newest data space, for example, that was launched a couple of weeks ago was dedicated to the automobile industry, and it's called Catena X. So the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust is adopting the data space model, since we believe if it can be done for clinical trial data or bank accounts information, why can't we do it to improve our decision-making for open access publishing? One of the International Data Space Association main motto is to not reinvent the wheel. Therefore, we believe it's important to learn from what other industries have done and adapt to the successful strategies for an improved open access books management and publication. You might be asking the question on where we are in the process. So we are midway through our journey to launch a data space, and we are building upon years of research and now focusing on our governance and policy development. This midpoint is focused on the development of principles and values that will then transform into the terms parties agree to in order to participate in the data trust. This might be a challenging part of the process, and that's why we are making sure that we gather the feedback and consult the community on agreeing and the ethical and security guardrails and requirements for the data exchange within the data trust. The terms and governance mechanisms we develop in this phase will be piloted in the data space model, which is aimed to happen next year. So the technical work to build out that data space is advancing via separate projects. And if you like to be one of the first to pilot the data exchange, feel free to contact us separately as we are confirming those partnerships for 2024. The current phase is supported by the Mellon Foundation that has provided our team with $1.24 million to support this journey and become an open scholarly infrastructure. In addition to supporting our inaugural board's development, we're now creating the data space rulebook with the mentioned principles to specify the rules that will govern the community's membership as it works to exchange and use data. In addition to working to prevent unintended consequences while ensuring trust in the usage data that is exchanged, we also will be working on the sustainability and understanding the financial return of investment for the first set of organizations piloting data exchange through the trust. On the right-hand side, you can see the current project advisory board and the principal project investigators as well. So there are different parts of the data exchange rulebook. We can divide them into 4 main aspects: organizational governance, technical processes, data-focused principles, and participant-faced processes. In this session, we will be discussing the data-focused principles, and we would very much like your reflection on some of the outcomes of a recent data rulebook workshop that was held in Brussels in April this year. Since we don't have a lot of time together, we will not be able to cover everything. However, the aim is to get your thoughts and feedback on what's important to make sure we address, recognizing that this is just one of the many consultations we will be hosting in 2023. So just a quick overview of the workshop I mentioned. So this was organized in April. It took place in Brussels, and it gathered publishers, libraries, standards, and service representatives to draft principles and identify trust mechanism for such an IDS or international data space infrastructure. These drafted principles and requirements are now being shared with the global open science community for consultation, like I'm doing here today. Based on some pre-workshop work that we did via surveys, we also managed to pinpoint the priorities based on the answers from the different stakeholders involved in terms of what we would be offering through the data trust. The first 3 items supported as a priority were multi-platform usage, aggregate counter-compliant book usage, and aggregate counter-compliant chapter usage. The 4th and 5th were of value depending on the stakeholder group. The thing to note is that with the data space, we can always improve the quality and timelines of usage data exchange across both public and private parties. And essentially, the data trust can provide an intermediary service. Much like the mentioned switchboard does for financials, we do this for usage. And we, of course, adhere to the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, but we recognize that the data itself has to be as open as possible, but as a control as necessary to allow access both to public and commercially generated usage. Here are some quotes we heard during the Brussels workshop as well, in terms of the value the participants saw in open access book usage data space. And they were very much in line with what you might expect in terms of the value of improved author care and scholar support, to have a more complete data picture, to make more effective, efficient use of resources, fostering innovation and growth, good metrics that are reliable and can be trusted, and of course, one that I have mentioned already, which is creating possibilities to make informed decisions at all levels. So before we dive into the active part, I wanted to take a moment to allow everyone to get familiar with the Mentimeter tool we will be using for sharing thoughts and voting. So the idea is that you either scan the QR code you see on the slide, or you can also go, and I hope you see my Mentimeter slide now. You can go to menti.com and enter this code here. So I'm just curious to know, as a test run for the Mentimeter, if everyone can just add, where are you joining this session from? And we will be able to also follow the answer as they are added. Thank you everyone for adding. And if anyone has any issues with this, just let me know if something is not working. Oh, we have people from mostly US, if I'm not mistaken. I'm based in Europe, so it's afternoon for me, late afternoon. But I believe for everyone there is probably morning time, so good morning. I see some more answers coming in, so great. You see, it seems like everyone is happy to use Mentimeter and things are working fine, so I suppose we can proceed. So my next question to you, since we saw that Mentimeter is working, is to share what you see as benefits in having better access to open access book usage data. So based on the priorities you see here, you can think about those, but also consider something that maybe is not listed, or anything else that comes to your mind. So you can scan the QR code, or you can also go to menti.com and enter the code. I see we already have some answers, which is great. Take your time, you have a minute or two. And the idea is that we will take a few moments also to discuss some of the answers. So we can have a look at the answers so far. Thank you very much for sharing, and please, there is still time, keep sharing. I will give you a few more moments, so please do have a think and share your thoughts. Okay, I think this is almost everyone. No, oh, I was too fast. Keep adding, Phil. You can add more answers as well. You don't need to add just one. So if you have more thoughts, you can add multiple options. Okay, so let's have a look. I'm very curious, and thank you so much for all this answer. This is amazing. I don't know who wrote the easier to ask for call dev money relocation to open access. Could I ask whoever wrote this to specify what call dev means? I'm sorry, I'm not from a library background, so I don't know if this is a specific jargon. Collection development. Thank you, Dorothea. She wrote in the chat. Okay, yes. That's very interesting. I see more timely access to data, make better tenure and promotion arguments about impact, help faculty who are up for tenure talk about their impact. I see this is very interesting and very valuable feedback, especially for researchers, to better promote open access to authors, future direction understanding, better structure. So there is a lot of conversations about authors being able to promote themselves and get more visibility through the value of their work, which is something that has also come up from the workshop we had in Brussels. Thank you for that. You're confirming what has already been shared as well. Multi-platform usage, definitely. Another tenure. Is anyone who wrote about the tenure willing to give us a little bit more background in terms of why is this such an important tool for professors and researchers? If you are, please do unmute yourself and just speak up. I would be very curious to hear a little bit more context behind this. No takers?
This wasn't my comment, but I do know that one of the primary drivers behind publication in general is for scholars' ability to achieve promotion and tenure. And in many disciplines, this idea, there is unfortunately the idea that open access is kind of a lesser tier of work. And so if there can be solid numbers behind the reach that a particular book or article is creating, and because demonstrating impact, and in particular demonstrating concrete impact, is becoming more and more of an issue in tenure and promotion packages, having individuals be able to have solid numbers behind how far their work is reaching is increasingly important.
Thank you, Liz. And since I guess more and more researchers need to publish open access, I guess this is going to become an even more major problem going forward, correct? If we don't find a way to provide these metrics.
Yeah, I work with humanities professors especially, and what I have observed is that they often get kind of anecdotal feedback that their open access publications have reached readers in different countries and kind of different institutions than they would have reached before, but they don't have an easy way to kind of aggregate that information, and that's what I think often they're looking for additionally. So that's kind of more the positive case, that like they know that they're having more impact than they would otherwise have had if they hadn't published OA, but they don't have the best tools to be able to talk about it in a way that is, you know, easy and succinct to convey in a tenure or promotion file.
Thank you, Ma. And I guess this also gives more value to publishing open access if we can prove that open access books are actually reaching the right audience and how. So that is very valuable feedback. Thank you so much. And I'm just looking at some of the other comments. So I guess the potential for better measures is also goes hand in hand with what we just discussed. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in as well is to justify further institutional support for open access. I don't know who wrote that, if they wish to speak up, or if somebody else has any comments. It would be interesting to know how can a data space for data exchange on open access books help with that. Does anyone have any views on
that?
this?
Was me. Sorry, I didn't want to speak up again, but I also wrote that point. At our institution, we're coming up against having to renew funding for open access, because currently we're still working on this institution funded model where we support open access directly with the presses, and the question of whether it's worth it is a big one. And so making it easier to make the case that actually this is substantially more impactful than non-open access publishing would be great, because it's an expensive program to run, and we're having to kind of fight for renewal right now. And I know a lot of the other funding institutions that were involved in the TOME initiative are also making their cases for renewal right now, or for a new version of the program. So it's timely.
Okay, no, that's very interesting to know. Thank you for your feedback, and thank you everyone for adding. We will move on to be able to do some other, but don't worry, we will save this feedback and use it to inform our future discussions as well. So let me go back to the presentation. So one of the other things that you all mentioned as well, in a way, was about terms and definitions, because when we talk about open access metrics, we also need to use some terminology that is recognizable and understandable by different stakeholders, from authors to publishers to book aggregators, etc. And for that reason, in this effort of the data trust, we don't want to recreate the wheel. We don't want to invent something that may not have the same understanding from the community. So to give you an example, we are leveraging definitions from others as much as possible. I mentioned already to you the International Data Space Association as the source for the data space model. So logically, we are using their terms when we are talking about the different components of the data space, from data contributor to data consumer to data access, etc. However, we also are looking at other organizations and efforts that are already present, such as Counter and others as well, to make sure that we are leveraging these definitions that the community is already familiar with. However, since this landscape is quite large and it's not always easy to capture everything that is going on, I wanted to ask you, and let me switch to the next question, what definitions or sources of definitions you think are missing? So what it is that we should be particularly paying attention to, if there is something that is going on open access book metrics or data exchange that you think is relevant and should be considered as well in terms of source for different standards or anything like that. So feel free to share. I will give you a couple of minutes. You can go back to that slide to give you an idea what we already have. Okay. I know this is probably a very specific question, so don't worry. If you cannot think of anything, you can always let us know later on and contact us if you had any other ideas. But yes, thank you for adding your contributions. And I haven't heard of the seamless access, so we'll definitely look into that. And the definition of reader, patron, and user. Yes, definitely this is something to consider. So thank you both to the authors who have contributed. This is super useful. So to talk about the rules and principles to ensure trust, I wanted to share with you one of the reports that has been very instrumental to us in this project and by the Open Data Institute, called Designing Trustworthy Institutions Report, which shows different expectations of a trust depending on if you are a data provider, downstream data user, organization, or individual affected by data use. As, for example, as a repository working with the trust as a usage data provider, maybe the repository would want a clear understanding of the rules and controls in place, assurance that participation would protect their reputation and provide them with value that outweighs any expenses in terms of time or money that has been invested in participation. Similarly, if the repository also is a participating data user, perhaps to leverage benchmarking or to get cleaned aggregated data, they probably would want a fair, equitable access to reliable data that is updated in a timely manner. They, I assume, would also want assurance that the data is appropriate to their needs and that quality and data processing algorithms are transparent. Finally, if institutions are choosing between working with one repository or another, the repository would probably want to ensure that data trust participation would do no harm to their organization, that sensitive data would not be visible to direct competitors or potentially reduce interest among potential members. So supporting such varied needs at the global scale can require insight not only in the data supply chain that we showed you before, but also its stakeholders. So that's why we are talking to you today as well. The data space participants would range from a variety of stakeholders that would be data creators, data consumers, or sometimes both. And this is why it's important to have these sessions for feedback and suggestions to make sure everyone can contribute and that we hear all points of view. And one of the things we would want to know, and I'm going to skip to the next slide, you will have three options when you scan the code now or go to the menti.com page. I would just like to know, do you generate usage data, or as a second option, do you provide usage data reports, analytics, products, or services to internal stakeholders in your organization, or do you do this outside for the stakeholders outside of your organization? You can choose multiple options as well, yeah, take a few moments to do this. Thank you to the ones already answering. I will give you a couple of minutes, well, couple seconds. Oh, very interesting distribution, very equal in a way. Okay, interesting. Thank you so much for providing your answers. It's interesting to see that the majority of you provide this type of reports internally and externally, and then that you also generate usage data. So I'm very curious then to discuss the next points that we will be discussing in a moment. Okay, so here is an overview of some of the concerns and solutions we heard when we were talking to the stakeholders during the workshop in Brussels. This particular group was about trust in open access usage data you would receive when you're participating in a data space. So some of the concerns raised during the conversation were about gaming the system, inflating numbers, selective data sharing, false data, misinformation, and similar. Some of the solutions that were provided during the workshop were about membership tied to behavior, that it's very important to define acceptable practices, and that the data contributions should be limited to those with authority to share and manage the data. So in order to not miss something and to make sure that we listen to your point of view as well and what you find to be a concern, but as well as solution, I want to ask you if you could add your own thoughts to this. So what would you add regarding data quality in terms of if you are participating, for example, in the open access usage data trust as an open access usage data consumer? Do you have any concerns or solutions? And you should have this slide now, this question now on your Mentimeter, but I'm going to keep this slide up just so that you can see what has already been mentioned. Of course, if you have the same, it's not a problem. I'm also interested to see how many of you see these concerns, but as well, if you see something missing, please do mention it in your response. Okay, see we have a few answers already. So I'm going to keep this slide up so that you can browse through the text for inspiration. Okay. I assume, and I know this is a little bit more of a tinker, so don't worry. If you can't come up with something straight away, take your time. We have another minute or two. Okay, let's see the answers so far. Interesting about concerns about incompleteness. That's quite an important one. Transparency on how the data is generated. Also, something that has been raised by participants as well. Responsible contextualization of usage data that is shared. That is something that I would like to ask whoever wrote that, if they are comfortable in speaking up. I would like to understand a little bit more, why is that a concern and what do you exactly mean?
Hi, yes, I shared that. Thanks, Ursula. I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of metrics reports, contextualizing perhaps by field or in comparison to what. So thinking about the data, but also in the larger context.
And responsible is quite an important word here, right?
Yes.
No, definitely. This is something that I will make note of, because it's definitely an important part of the data sharing and receiving. And to that point, I guess whoever wrote what else is being done with data, that's definitely something that we are thinking it needs to be transparent, and we are actually asking for feedback on that as well. So if you have any more feedback, if you have any solutions that you would like to offer that you know of, or that you think will work, please add that as well. So we are looking for both concerns, but also solutions. So if you have any ideas on that, do share. I'm also looking on the other answers. interesting about the web crawls as well, and bot elimination. Thank you for that point. This is something that we were talking about before, that the data should be as open as possible, but as controlled as necessary. So definitely goes with our motto in a way. And yes, the last point as well, how we will make these different metrics commensurate without flattening the differences. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, just to make sure that we manage to go through the last 2 points, which I think would be quite interesting to you as well. So in terms of the other side, where is trust in participating as an open access usage data provider. So whoever would provide data into and ingest data into the data space. Some of the concerns that were raised were about sensitive data leaks to competitors, if the data access could result in poaching of authors, if the data would be released outside of their authority to share, and if any restricted data would be disclosed. So these were some of the concerns. The solutions offered for this were about data access that is as controlled as necessary, which we also just mentioned, and that there should be accountability of those receiving the data. So some of you also mentioned this concern. If you remember from the previous slide, and I'm going to go back, we talked about defined acceptable practices. One of the solutions was to also have defined unacceptable practices. So there is a need to define both. And finally, one of the solutions was to industry standard cybersecurity practices. So as you can imagine, I would like to ask you as well, in this case, what would you add as an open access usage data provider? Are there any concerns or solutions that you think are missing from here? Anything else you can think of from a point of view of a usage data provider? And thank you, Dorothea, for your comment in the chat. Yes, to defining unacceptable practices. So definitely this is something that came up from many different participants. So thank you for confirming. This is valuable to everyone. But feel free to share if there is anything else. What specifically would you consider unacceptable as a data provider? You can add those to the board as well. If there is something very specific that would maybe make you not trust this data exchange or not want to participate.
Ursula, I also want to make sure you see the comment about context as well, that not only is it important to talk about disciplinary context, but also comparisons between open access and non-open access books in that kind of context.
Thank you for bringing it up. And sorry, Beth, I didn't mean to ignore your comment. I'm not the best one at keeping track of everything that's going on in the chat. So I'm going to read it out. Part of the context involves looking at data for comparable non-open access books, as we can do on platforms like JSTOR and Muse that host both. Otherwise, it's hard to show what the open access figures mean or how much more often or widely the open access books are used. Yes, it's true. Just for a little bit of a background information, the open access usage data trust is currently only working on a minimal viable product, meaning that we are starting with the open access books as a first. Obviously, if this is something that the rest of the community would find interesting to explore, I don't see why in the future we cannot have this type of data exchange for other types of products as well, not just books. However, this is not something that we are focusing on right now. Currently, we are working on launching a data space for open access books. However, your comment is very much valuable and taken on board, and it is not the only one we received like that. So thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. Right, I'm going to jump to the answers interesting about the data minimization principles and processes, and the data that doesn't exist can't be hacked or leaked. Thank you for that. Unacceptable practices, precise end user geolocation, timestamps, re-identification, behavioral track. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. This is very, very interesting. And sharing selling data with data brokers. Thank you. We will make a note of that and consider and obviously get more feedback from the community and the other stakeholders as well on this particular point. Thank you, everyone. This is very useful. And feel free to add anything else that you would want to add. In the interest of time, I will go to the last one of this that we have, which is about trusted usage data exchange and processing won't harm readers or authors. And I'm going to skip to the next here. There you go. So some of the concerns, and this I think would be very much familiar to you as well, is about identifying individual readers, being forced to support book censorship, author harm, usage metrics being misused. So this is maybe ties in with the last comments in our Mentimeter as well. Solutions that were provided were about data space as the raw data exchange, so zero copy principle, exchange tied to existing licenses, business relationships, aggregate and benchmarking calculation only without identification, and global legal compliance with privacy and data minimization regulations. So as you see, some of these have already been mentioned by you as well, which is a great confirmation. But please do think about what else is out there that maybe isn't covered by any of these solutions or any of these concerns that you think would, especially with the solution that would particularly help making sure that readers or authors are not harmed in this process. So what else would you add to this? I'm going to go back to that slide. Seems to be another one that needs a little bit more thinking time. Don't worry if you can't think of anything else. Anything that comes to your mind that you think might be useful, you're free to share in the Mentimeter. And this is the last one of this one, I promise. Zero copy, Julia, is a policy of not creating a copy of data. So, for example, in databases, you have copies of the original data, for example. In a data space exchange, there is no zero copy. There is no copies of the data. The data is exchanged as it comes from the provider directly to the consumer. So it's an exchange where you don't create a new repository or database. Thank you, everyone, for your suggestions. And thank you for the US comment about the insufficient protection, particularly around data brokerage. That is something that we have been discussing. And since this is a global effort, we are taking into account the different data and privacy measures that are in different places. As you know, in Europe, we have the GDPR, which is different from what is in the US. So this is something we're definitely taking into consideration, how we can make sure that this effort takes all of that into consideration. And this is also why we are following this data space model, because as I told you before, it has been anchored in the European Commission support, and it has been developed and it has been used by so many different industries already, proving that it works with sensitive data as well. Thank you everyone for adding your comments. There is one last question I wanted to ask you after we have gone through all of this. And based on what we have discussed so far, and I'm going to skip this one. Based on what we have discussed so far, my personal view is that it's very important that we know what would help you trust that people and organizations participating in that exchange are held accountable to community rules. So what it is that as library publishers or librarians or any other type of stakeholder would convince you, would make you feel at ease, and would help you trust in this particular type of data exchange, and that people are held accountable to community rules. So please share your thoughts. I'll give you a minute or two. I have moved to this slide as well, so you can just move to this slide when you're providing your answer. But keep in mind that this is very, very valuable feedback for us, so feel free to share. Well, I'm glad you are happy that we are taking on board your input, and of course we would. Librarians and library publishers are one of the most important stakeholders as well, so thank you for this feedback. Certification, yes, that it's in line with what we are working on, so that's also great to hear. I know we only have 4 minutes left. Please do keep your answers coming. I will just share with you a couple more slides. I just want to tell you what is happening with the feedback you are giving us. So your feedback is helping us move from defining the values and principles to documenting them as formal legal terms, conditions, and contracts that will be piloted next year. So as you can imagine, it has a very big impact. We will be having community consultations throughout the year. And if you want to take part into more focus groups and provide your feedback, you can. So on the right-hand side at the top, you can see QR codes that you can scan to sign up for focus groups that we will have in the last part of 2023, probably October, November time. You can also follow on the left-hand side, you'll see a QR code that will lead you to our events on our website. So you can definitely join our live conversations that are happening online as you're doing here and in person. You can read our quarterly update via the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust announcement list. And you can follow us on social media, Twitter and LinkedIn. With that, I want to say a big thank you to everyone. It's been a pleasure to hear your thoughts. And I also want to open the floor if anyone has any final comments or question and anything else that you would like to share. I just wanted to give everyone a final 2 minutes because I have been talking too much. So please do mute yourself if you want to share anything else. And thank you so much for